All right, I'll start off then. Uh, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land I'm speaking from, and pay my respects to the elders past and present. I'm David Briggs, the chair of the New South Wales Division of the Colour Society of Australia, the Australian member body of the International Colour Association, or AIC. The Colour Society of Australia is a 100% volunteer-run, not-for-profit organisation and welcomes all to its members, its events and its membership. This event continues a series of webinars presented free of charge by the Colour Society of Australia New South Wales Division since 2020. Before we begin tonight's presentation from Neil Parkinson, I'd like to mention our next couple of events. On Sunday, March 22nd, to mark International Colour Day, we'll have our second forum in collaboration with the AIC Study Group of Arts and Design, this time on rendering artwork with lighting. The forum will be hosted by CSA New South Wales Division Secretary Vladi Rosolova and will include presentations by 4 experts on lighting artworks, followed by a panel discussion. Then on Sunday, April 19th, we'll have a presentation by artist, lecturer and researcher Edward R. Charbonneau from the Minneapolis College of Art and Design. We have a full house of 100 registrants tonight from all over the world, so we're asking everyone to stay muted. But if you have questions for Neil, please submit them in the chat during the talk, and we'll get as many as we can at the end. We warmly thank Nick Harkness for inviting Neil to present for us tonight, and so I'll hand it over to Nick to introduce Neil. Thanks, Nick.
Thank you, David, for your introduction, and also the Colour Society of New South Wales for your continuing support of the Canberra Colour Club. Welcome everybody to the first Colour Club webinar for 2026. Just some history. Since a small group has started the CCC approximately 18 months ago, we've run a number of very successful webinars, including Ural Lipska, co-author of the outstanding Das Farben book, followed by Dr. Alexandra Losky, the curator at the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, and co-author of the equally outstanding Colour Concepts 1686 to 1963. Alphonse Gumby, a New York City-based artist, presenting his documentary Colour, followed by Fiona McLaughlin, Professor of Architecture at the University of Edinburgh, and October, Maggie Maggio with Stephen Westland in October at the Colour Society's annual conference in Sydney. We start this year with tonight's speaker, Neil Parkinson. Neil is the Archives and Collection Manager for the Library at the Royal College of Art at Kensington in London. Neil will be followed in June by Professor Elisa Corto-Yare. Elisa is a professor at the School of Design of the Faculty of Architecture and Arts at the University of Austral de Chile. Elisa has published many books and research papers on her extensive studies of the Colores del Valdivia in southern Chile. Welcome, Neil, to the Canberra Colour Club. The interest in your presentation has been huge, and the session is well oversubscribed. We are all more than a little jealous of your role at the Royal College of Art. Surrounded by 2,000 books on colour, and we cannot wait for your talk today to learn more about your world of colour, books, and of course your recent history of colour. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Nick, and thank you, David. Thank you both for inviting me to join you today, and thank you everybody for dialing in. It's really lovely to be able to speak to you this evening / this morning about my role managing the Colour Reference Library, which, as Nick says, is held at the Royal College of Art in London, where I work. Let me just get my screen. Okay, does that look all right?
That's great.
Looks good.
Yeah. Good. Okay. Yes, in the Colour Reference Library, we welcome visitors from all over the world. So to our little corner of South Kensington. So it's nice to feel that the direction of travel is reversed for once, and I get to sort of take the library out to another part of the world and give you a little glimpse of its remarkable and quirky nature. So this evening's session has the title The Colour Librarian, but I could just as easily have called it The Accidental Colour Librarian, because the Colour Reference Library was and still is just one of around 30 different special collections that I look after and that I took on when I started at the RCA many years ago now. But it was the one that I had prior knowledge of. It was the one that had kind of seeped out into the public consciousness and that was well known in the research community. And it's still probably the best known of our public resources. It's also one of the most interdisciplinary, and I think those two facts are probably related. So I think we're together for about an hour this evening. So I'm going to start by giving you my standard 20-minute introduction to the Colour Reference Library, explaining its origins, its history, and its arrangement. And then I'll spend about 30 minutes focusing on 3 or 4 of my favorite titles in the whole collection and what they represent, and hopefully time for a few questions at the end if we have any. Just a quick introduction to the Royal College of Art, the RCA itself, if you aren't familiar with my employer. So the RCA is the only exclusively postgraduate art and design university in the world. It was founded all the way back in 1837 as the Government School of Design. And then in the 1850s, we became the National Art Training School based at South Kensington, where we still are. We grew up as part of the new cultural complex that followed on from the 1851 Great Exhibition. And that complex also included the Victoria and Albert Museum, and we still have a lot of institutional links with them. We finally became the Royal College of Art in 1896, but we've always been much more than a traditional art college, and we've always tried to balance art and design, a lot of involvement in cutting edge technology, a lot of interest in fostering interdisciplinarity in the creative fields. So we're often known for our star painting alumni, such as David Hockney and Bridget Riley, but there have been many achievements across all the design fields as well. Textile designers of the 50s and 60s like Althea McNish and Zandra Rhodes, industrial designers James Dyson and Thomas Heatherwick, and fashion designers including Philip Tracy, Erdem, and Claire Waite Keller. So today we have over 2,000 students following over 20 different programs at master's level or above. So what exactly is the Colour Reference Library and how did it end up at the RCA? Well, it's pretty much as its fairly prosaic name describes. It is a special collection of material, largely books, that engages fundamentally with the subject of colour in all its forms and all its disciplines. It's not just a collection, it's a kind of physical manifestation of a huge body of knowledge. It spans 7 centuries and it covers every possible aspect and format of its subject, from the history of pigments to colour psychology. It includes all the key figures that you'd expect, from Isaac Newton to Joseph Albers, and it also takes in a lot of ephemeral and proprietary colour charts and even a few archives. It's now probably the largest public collection of books on colour in the world, depending on how you count. So the earliest item that you can see here on the left is a 14th century manuscript analysing the colours of the rainbow and their different personalities, as inspired by the writings of Aristotle. The collection continues right up to the present day with lots of works from the 20th and 21st centuries. And on the right is a cover you might recognise, Chromophobia by David Batchelor, a slim book about Western anxiety around bright colour, which I'm sure many of you know it. It's been hugely influential since it was first published in 2000. But I mention it because it was partly researched at the Colour Reference Library when David was an RCA tutor on our Curating Contemporary Art course. Now, the collection's origins can be found somewhere in this photo from around 1941, which I promise is the only black and white slide I have for you today. It's an image of the RCA students in the Second World War. after they'd been evacuated to the rural Lake District in the northwest of England from our London premises after all the windows of our building got blown out in the Blitz. So the RCA essentially decamped to the Lake District and took over 2 local hotels in Ambleside, and teaching continued unbroken. So here are the students sketching on the slopes and having a very bohemian and bucolic war. There's obviously no enemy planes in the skies overhead in this particular picture. One of these students was a young man named Donald Pavey, who was studying painting at the RCA, and he went on to have a lifelong obsession with all kinds of esoteric subjects, including alchemy, comparative religion, the psychology of games, all sorts of interesting stuff. But perhaps his biggest enthusiasm was reserved for colour, and the subject obsessed him for decades, as it has gripped so many others throughout history. Don ended up collecting a number of rare books on the subject over the years, and he became an art tutor at Kingston School of Art in southwest London, and he always planned to use his collection to write a definitive history of colour systems, but his own book never materialized. The sheer scale of the task defeated him. I can certainly relate to that. And he ended up selling the collection in the early 1970s to a colleague at Kingston named Stuart Durant. And Stuart Durant was, perhaps not coincidentally, another RCA alumnus. They get everywhere, I find. So here is the lovely Stuart, who died in 2020, and this Guardian obituary refers to the Colour Reference Library as one of his legacies. Now, Stuart had lots of connections to the rare book trade, and he substantially enhanced the collection through his multiple contacts, and he was sort of poised, ready to pounce whenever he knew an important work was going to come up at auction. And he also tracked down works by obscure and hidden figures who had published on the subject, including Mary Gartside, Carrie Van Beemer, and Maxwell Armfield, some of whom have now been recently rediscovered long after first publication. So Stuart had a good eye, and he also played a long game. And with the help of his friends in the antiquarian book trade, he eventually built up a really impressive collection that really aspired to be essentially the national collection on colour. This is part of the collection in situ today, and the reason it ended up at the RCA is because of the college librarian of the 1970s, an erudite figure named Hans Brill, who is the third and final character in our origin story. So Hans mounted a successful campaign to buy the collection for the college when he heard it was going to be sold abroad. Stuart was planning to sell it to a wealthy private collector. And the RCA thought, quite rightly, that it would be an excellent interdisciplinary resource for the students, one that could give RCA students a sure grounding in colour theory while providing authoritative solutions to problems with colour in design and inspiring new creations directly in the studio, which it has always done and it still continues to do. So it arrived at the college in the late 1970s, containing about 700 titles. But as I think Nick mentioned, that figure is now closer to 2,000. We still actively collect new books and we fill in gaps when we can get old books that are missing. It's not a closed collection in any way. And all of the big beasts, all of the titans of colour theory are represented, from the 11th century Arab polymath Alhazen to the Bauhaus figures of Itten and Albers. So the collection tries to accommodate the extraordinary reach and capacity of the subject of colour and to examine it through every possible lens. There are books devoted to the colour ranges of particular things, from mushrooms to national flags to human skin tones. And there are books about the history and symbolism of individual colours and their application to different fields, from architecture to textiles. There are also books about colour perception, including optical illusions and after images. There are lots of books that are just about blue or just about red, but there are not very many that are just about purple or orange. But the subject is incredibly difficult to break into bite-sized chunks or to fit into a clear narrative or a classification scheme. I host a lot of group visits from people who come for an introduction to the Colour Reference Library, And I usually pitch it as a wider introduction to the subject of colour as a phenomenon, as illustrated through some of the key texts we hold. And I often break it into 5 broad sections to consider in turn how colour has historically been explained, organised, perceived, felt, and imagined. And this means we get to cover everything from Newton's original colour circle to Munsell's 3D model of colour to Lucia's colour test. We'll come to these later, and to balance objective and subjective approaches wherever possible. It is perfectly possible to be just entirely forensic and analytical about colour, but this approach I find doesn't really gel with art students, hence the need for that final section, Colour Imagined. Unfortunately, one of the things that I love about the collection is its open-mindedness. The scientific legitimacy of the titles hasn't always been as important as their approach to the subject. So while we have plenty of books that are about the physics and chemistry of colour, we also have quite a bit of esoterica in the form of rather weird books about colour healing and auras and the transcendental qualities of colour-based experiences. So this is an area that spoke to both Don Pavey and Stuart Durand. They both shared an interest in mysticism, so it's not surprising there's plenty of room for it on the shelves. So for example, while Stuart was putting the collection together in the 1970s, he acquired the unpublished colour notebooks of an early 20th century artist called Maxwell Armfield, who had recently died. Armfield fell under the spell of the occult movements of Edwardian England, and he became obsessed with the idea that colour might be a layer between our world and some other higher plane. He thought it was a secret code to be cracked, and that if the spectrum could be mapped onto other concepts, such as musical scales, or the tarot deck, or the signs of the zodiac, things like that, it might reveal itself as one of the supernatural building blocks of the universe. As you can see, all approaches to the subject are valid in the CRL, we don't judge, and those ideas aren't a million miles away from Newton's anyway. So these are some examples from his published and unpublished work. His colour Sephira diagram as an original drawing on the left as part of his archives that we hold, and then how it appeared in print in one of his books on the right. So the mystical or pseudoscientific dimensions of colour recur across the collection, and they sometimes pose challenges. For example, we have an interesting mid-century book on the healing power of coloured rays by a certain Dr. Hilton. And it's notable, not just because it was published posthumously, but because it was actually written by the author after he died, dictated from beyond the grave through a spirit medium called Irene. It was a challenge for my colleague in the library who had to catalogue it and had to decide whether to record a ghost or a fantasist as the principal author of the work. So how is the collection used? Well, books beget books, and it is in frequent use by researchers working on publications about colour, its history, cultural significance, and applications, such as these here. It's also used by cultural historians, curators, and conservators to research available paints and standards in particular periods in history to help reverse engineer and better understand the works in their care. But it's principally used as intended as a practical resource by artists and designers, especially RCA students who are conveniently already on site to support and inspire hundreds of new studio-based artworks and products and projects. So this is a small selection of RCA student projects that have been informed by contact with our books. Colour itself never goes out of fashion, so the library is both timeless and topical, and it's recently informed investigations into various issues of the day, including colour and gender, colour and ethnicity, colour naming, traditional recipes for natural dyes, and colour and neurodiversity. Our open-minded collecting policy sometimes makes it a tricky collection to organise and to market to the research community. And there are a lot of tensions in the collection, a lot of arguments between the books in a way. between art and science, between subjectivity and objectivity, and between the natural and the synthetic. No two pathways through the resource are alike. There are as many approaches and research questions as there are users. And this is a strength in a postgraduate art college where people often learn in unconventional ways. It's possible to have a rewarding session in the Colour Reference Library without actually reading a single word. Some visitors literally just look at the pictures, or at least immerse themselves in the abundance of colour palettes and samples on offer. But equally, it's possible to research your subject without encountering a single colour plate. There's no colour in any of the diagrams in Newton's optics, for instance. I recently made this guide to put up beside the titles in the store to help users navigate the shelves. Any librarians in attendance this evening might recognize the famous Dewey Decimal System that you still find in many public and some academic libraries today. This is how the Colour Reference Library is organized. So the Dewey Decimal System is an American system that organizes all the world's knowledge into 10 main subject categories, including religion, technology, science, and the arts, with increasingly detailed subdivisions beneath each one. And I'm including this slide because it shows the astonishing granularity of the subject, how the subject of colour can be broken down. Did a quick count, and there are about 100 different subjects identified here under the colour umbrella, from fortune telling to camouflage to ink to city planning. You'll see that all 10 sections have at least a few colour-related topics under them. It's such an interdisciplinary subject because, as we all know, colour is part of the fabric of life, both of day-to-day human experience and our intentional self-expression. It's something we receive and something we transmit, which makes the RCA an ideal home for it, where our students could be studying anything from painting to fashion to healthcare design. So smashing up the subject into 100 fragments like this is both a help and a hindrance. It's often very difficult for cataloguers to know exactly where to slot a particular title. And even among all these categories, there are multiple crossovers, and huge numbers of titles just end up being shelved or shoved into one of two categories that I've highlighted here, marked in red, and essentially standing for colour in science and colour in art. So that's an introduction to the organising principles of the Colour Reference Library. And for the rest of our time this evening, I thought I'd pick out a few highlights to discuss. 3 books in particular that are emblematic of some of the big themes that colour embodies, and that are also, I think, lovely artifacts and triumphs of design or colour printing in their own right. So with nearly 2,000 titles, I could have chosen many others, but these selections are all, I think, I hope, fascinating and radical examples of particular approaches. They are about colour perception, colour language, and colour psychology in that order. How we experience, how we describe, and how we feel colour. They chart shifting approaches to the subject over a span of just over 100 years and take us from 1830s Paris to 1950s New York. But they all still feel current, and they have things to tell us today about our relationship with colour and its timeless, boundless power. So the first of the 3 is probably the most famous and the most complicated in format. I'm going to start with Chevreul's Law of Simultaneous Contrast of 1839, but I'm not going to focus on the main book so much as the illustrated atlas of illustrations that accompanied it. And in this picture, the atlas is the taller, thinner book in the background. So Chevreul was a French chemist who lived an absolutely amazing life. He was brought up during the French Revolution. He then undertook pioneering work on fats, candles. He discovered and named cholesterol, but we know him for his contribution to colour theory from when he worked at the prestigious Gobelin tapestry firm in the 1820s and was brought in to oversee their dyeing processes. And he walked into the middle of a massive dispute between the weavers and the dyers of the firm. The weavers were complaining to the dyers that the quality of the dye just wasn't good enough. The colours seemed to be fading. The black colours were turning orangey red. It was a potential PR disaster. So Chevreul investigated, did all the tests you would expect on the color fastness of the dyes, and discovered that the black was not actually fading, but its appearance was changing depending on the colors that surrounded it. And that this was a kind of permanent state of color, that it was endlessly fluid and it would appear different according to our perception, depending on whatever context it appeared in. And that any color would start to look a bit like the complementary color of the color that it was next to. And what was so amazing was the work that went into this, that he worked it up into a scientific law. He saw that it was a universal phenomenon, that it was a weird sort of unpredictability of color, but once you understood that, it was an incredibly predictable effect, and that this was something that people could work with. So he worked it up into the scientific law that he called simultaneous contrast, and summarized it by saying, where two colors appear side by side, they will appear as dissimilar as possible. So he worked it up into this incredible book from 1839 that was absolutely packed full of advice for different people working in different industries about how they could maximize the effects of this weird behavior of color. How, cartographers, museum curators, wallpaper designers, if they knew that color behaved in this weird way, it became a sort of powerful tool that they could exploit. So for cartographers, there was advice about sort of making the text as legible as possible on top of colored land masses. And for curators, he would say, oh, if you're displaying white marble objects, then you need to have this colored background in the gallery, and so on. So it's incredibly practical and incredibly sort of commercially minded in a way. But what's so interesting to me is the atlas that accompanied it, which was this book that was designed to accompany the main volume and provide lots of examples of how color works in practice. But because we're talking about 1839, color printing wasn't very advanced. It would have been very expensive and difficult to realize the color illusions and the weird color behavior in a lavishly illustrated book. So it had to be done in a sort of imaginative, ingenious, almost low budget way. So this is an image of the atlas from an auction house site. This is not our copy. It looks like our copy, but I don't think I would dare to arrange the pages in this kind of peacock fan. But this shows you, for example, that one of the ways that he did it was using different colored paper stocks and printing onto those. And the atlas overall is this incredible triumph of the tipped-in sheets, paper engineering, hand-colored plates, colored paper stocks, and so on. And it also has this series of extraordinary fold-out colored dots. There's a number of plates like this that extend outwards and that have colored dots on different backgrounds, white, grey, and black, to show the effect of the color contrast. And these were sort of large black and white lithographs, and then somebody had to come and individually hand paint all the dots to demonstrate the effect. Hopefully, it even works in this digital version. Across Zoom, you should be able to see, for instance, that the green dots are kind of clearer and brighter against the black than they are against the grey. And those coloured paper stocks mentioned before were to explore legibility of text on coloured backgrounds, and by putting them all side by side, it enabled this direct comparison. And Chevreul was able to show that, for instance, black text on a red background is almost impossible to read, but the one that he favoured was black text on a yellow background, and he thought this was the sharpest, clearest, easiest to read combination. And I mentioned that the books that I'm highlighting are all to some degree current in some way or ahead of their time, and this is a good example because that finding was very much vindicated in the 20th century. When more rigorous and objective perception tests concluded the same thing as Chevreul, as shown in this chart, adapted by Arthur and Piscini in their classic book on wayfinding, where all the different color combinations for signage are given this score out of 100 in terms of how easy they are to read, how easy they are to perceive. And top of the list down at the bottom in the top 16 color combinations is black on yellow, scoring 89 out of 100 for legibility. And you still see this all the time. So when you start to look for black and yellow signage, you spot it everywhere. In our airport signage, hazard tape, warning signs. Here it is in my local hospital for the eye clinic. You've got this kind of store guide of all these different hospital departments, but the eye clinic is in yellow and black to make it as easy and quick to pick out for anybody with visual impairments. And I also like Chevreul's book because it emphasizes the interdisciplinary nature of color and its application. So these plates from the Atlas, again, they demonstrate how flower beds should be planted for maximum impact. Now, Gertrude Jekyll, the celebrated, pioneering, radical English garden designer, was a student at the National Art Training School, the forerunner of the RCA that I mentioned before. She attended in the 1860s. And she learned all of Chevreul's principles. The students followed a very prescriptive curriculum where they were basically sort of told which color combinations worked and why they worked and so on. So she absorbed a lot of Chevreul's theories when she was studying to be a painter at the National Art Training School. And then after that, she pivoted to garden design. She took all of the ideas that she'd learned about color combination in painting and she transplanted them literally to the garden. And Chevreul had a substantial influence on artists, obviously the Neo-Impressionists, Seurat and Signac and so on, but his ideas also found their way into Van Gogh's palette through a kind of mediated form over the 19th century. Chevreul identified that color contrast was at its most intense whenever you paired colors that are on opposite sides of the color wheel, so blue and orange, red and green, purple and yellow. So with blue and orange, for instance, because each color starts to take on a tinge of its complementary, you get a bluer blue and you get a more orangey orange. So this really helped struggling artists because one of the things that they took from Chevreul's writing was that you didn't have to spend money on the most expensive, the most dazzling pigments. If you had cheaper, slightly duller pigments, you could still create a composition that put colors side by side in a way that it heightened them and made it look almost as if you'd bought the expensive paints. So Van Gogh absorbed all these ideas from Chevreul indirectly, as I say. And then in the later paintings from his Arles period here, you see all of those key pairings. You see the blue and orange, the purple and yellow. And then in the portrait on the bottom right, I like the fact that you've almost got two bands. You've got the kind of blue and orange along the top, and then you've got the red and green along the bottom half. And once again, these are timeless principles. So you still see a lot of blue and orange in film posters and advertising to the extent that people bemoan it nowadays as a lazy design cliche. But there is, of course, a physiological reason behind it, why it works, why it's so attention grabbing, why it's so inescapable that Chevreul pinpointed nearly 200 years ago now. So my next selection is about how colors are described, but it's also a good example of how color can be organized. So it's often said that most people can only really identify 11 different broad color categories, while they can perceive over 1 million different varieties. So clearly there's quite a big gap between language and experience of color. So this is a book called Dictionary of Color from 1930. It's an American book. It was compiled by two American color consultants, Alois Mertz and Morris Ray Paul. And it was an exhaustive attempt to standardize the color standards, to try to unite over 7,000, I think, color samples and link them to their popular names in different paint charts and other commercial systems that were available. So this would be a definitive book that would show you exactly what royal blue was supposed to look like, let's say, or fuchsia. Color was booming in products and on the page at this point. So there was a pressing need to establish a kind of common language, a common vocabulary for all the infinite varieties that were spinning off and appearing from all directions. Different bodies would state different claims to color names and ranges and varieties. So there was the American Textile Color Card Association, for example, that had been busy publishing an annual physical sample of colors in fashion every year from the 1910s onwards, I think. So Mertz and Paul spent years gathering this information, and they compiled it by pulling together samples from all the known systems they could find. They gathered all the previous books, all the commercial samples, and they cut everything up and they glued examples onto index cards so that comparable colors could be viewed side by side. And wherever there was a discrepancy, if they had two slightly different versions of, I don't know, royal blue or whatever, they'd average it out and find something in the middle. So the layout of the book is like this, and you have these color plates with all these varieties on the right-hand side, and then the terminology on the left. So you find your color sample, and then you look at the coordinates, the corresponding coordinates on the left, and it tells you what it should be called or what it has been called. And on this page, we've got names like baby pink and scarlet. But the typography is important, because if the title appears in all caps, then that means that's a color term that is in use at the point of the book being compiled. If it's just in title case, then that means it's a well-known name, but it's not in current use. And if it's in italics, it means it is just about still known, but effectively obsolete. So on this page, for instance, we've got one square that has fiesta and crushed strawberry in the same square. That's I10. So fiesta is in capitals because that's the current term. Crushed strawberry is the same color, but is starting to fall out of use. And because fashions change, nomenclature changes, technology changes all the time, there's a sense that this is just, sticking a pin in a fast changing industry, and that there's a kind of futility in the whole endeavor, a kind of built-in obsolescence to this book, because the authors admit that this is going to be superseded in a few years' time. So despite the enormity of the effort, is just a snapshot of color names in a particular moment. The authors, I think they were acutely aware of their own obsolescence, and they even call it a dictionary of color, not the dictionary of color. It's a work in progress. But like a lot of color books, like the Chevrolet, it sort of falls into two parts. There's the text section and there's the color-based section. So you have all of the color plates, and then you have this big chunk of descriptive text and a kind of history and biography of each color name at the back. And this glossary section is absolutely fascinating, full of kind of little nuggets that I hadn't really realized until I studied it in great detail, such as the fact that historically the difference in spelling for grey with an E and grey with an A, is because grey with an A was supposed to represent pure black and white, whereas grey with an E was supposed to represent that sort of grey with a tinge of another colour added. So it's not just a difference between UK and American spelling. And they made fun of the frivolous names for different shades that had been devised by the fashion industry. And they cite a 19th century book that straight-facedly listed all of these ridiculous names for colours of the moment, like stifled sigh and burnt opera house. And they also laugh about the name elephant's breath, but say that no one's ever found a sample of this famous elephant's breath. So everybody derides it as this ridiculous color name, but no one's ever been actually able to prove what color it is. And they also identified the inadequacy of a lot of color terms that were thought to be universal, such as nut brown and flesh. They ask, what sort of nut are you talking about? What color of flesh do you mean? You can see the entry for nut brown there at the bottom of the left-hand page, and they describe that as completely generic in character. There are various kinds of nuts. Most of them are brown, but the brown is a different color in each case. There is no such thing as an average nut. And their work had quite a bit of practical application. It was referred to by the US Department of Agriculture to specify acceptable colors for foodstuffs, such as canned peas and grapefruit juice. Peas had to reach a particular shade of green. I forget which one, but one of these squares was like the threshold of acceptable greenness. So it had a very, very practical application. There's a great book about this called Visualizing Taste by I. Hisano, about the history of food colouring, which is worth a look if you're interested in that particular angle. So Dictionary of Colour emerged at a time of great proliferation of colour schemes, as mentioned. And on the left, for instance, just to put it in some context, here's a scheme to identify the colour of flowers that was produced in 1900s Paris. And on the right is the UK's Wilson colour scheme of the 1930s, which borrowed heavily from the Parisian design. But interestingly, both try to integrate different terms for the colours in different systems to say this is the equivalent across these different systems. So it's more, these sorts of publications were just as much a kind of colour thesaurus as a colour dictionary. And then in the early 20th century, also had the Munsell system, which abandoned poetic and descriptive terms altogether and just used alphanumeric codes to show where a color variant would fit into its 3D model, where each iteration of each color can be expressed in terms of 3 variables, so where it sits on a spectrum of hue, value, and chroma. So the example Munsell gives in this, I think, is that a standard vermilion would be R5/9. So R for red, 5 for where it appears on the light and dark scale, and 9 for where it appears on the saturation scale. And I often show this to students who are visiting when we're talking about the 3-dimensional qualities of color. And we talk about how this is more or less the same as the slider bars that they're used to working with in Photoshop. But doing it all on the screen, of course. And sometimes colour names became almost localised or nationalised. So we have a lot of publications of the British Colour Council, including their textile swatch of 1934. You can see a little fragment of it there. So the British Colour Council was a kind of semi-official body that tried to regulate the use of colour in public buildings and on flags and so on. And this standard issue of colour names contain terms such as post office red and Union Jack blue, very kind of UK centric. And we have a similar publication from around the same time from the American Textile Color Card Association that has terms such as eggplant and old glory that are comparatively meaningless in the UK. So since I've been touching a little bit on colour and commerce, that brings us on to my third and final title, which was a real revelation to me when I was researching my own book. It was just one of those ones I plucked off the shelves and read from cover to cover and loved. This is Faber Biren's Selling Colour to People, which is a classic from 1956. So Biren was one of the 20th century's great self-styled colour gurus. He dropped out of university to pursue a career as a colour consultant, and he had great success advising industry on using colour effectively, especially during the explosion of commercial colour in post-war America, traditionally thought of as a time of optimism and bright palettes and deep pockets for consumer goods. I don't know where this image of him on the left is from. I've seen it a couple of times, but I don't know what the origin of it was, whether it was for a profile in a magazine or something. But I really love this publicity of image of him surrounded by all of his color charts and files of information and so on. It's a little bit Norman Rockwell and a little bit Mad Men. He comes across as sort of both folksy and business-like, and you get both of those kind of sides of his personality in his writing as well. He always strikes me as this kind of blend of quite a profound and deep scholar, but also a very sharp, canny marketer. He was really steeped in color history and symbolism, but he also took a hard-nosed approach to color as something that can make people behave in certain ways. And he devised the concept of what he called functional color, meaning color in environments that has no aesthetic value, but has a purpose to influence human behavior. So one thing he did was design national color schemes for hazard signage around heavy equipment. using different colors to denote risk of electrocution or burning or other sort of horrible injuries, to get people to step away from things that might cause them to regret it. So one of the ways, of course, that colour could be a powerful force to exert on people was as a means to get people to part with their cash. And Biren understood this better than anyone. For example, he showed a meat wholesaler that they could increase sales by painting the walls of their showrooms a pale green, which made the cuts of meat on display look more appetizing than against white. There was a kind of science behind his recommendations, but there was also, crucially, a lot of hard data. So all of his advice to manufacturers and retailers was informed by long-term studies of sales charts and how sales differed with different colorways on offer and what the kind of demographic was interested in buying. He was a user researcher before it was common practice, and he convened focus groups and he commissioned surveys to inform his findings. So here are a couple of the observations and findings from the book. On the left is the notion that color ranges become narrower and simpler the more mass market the product. High fashion at the top has lots of colors, very eccentric, very unconventional, very flamboyant. But the closer it filters down to the high street, the more the colors become limited and predictable. He thought the public was quite conservative and quite basic in its color tastes, but he thought this was a good thing. He viewed people as sort of unpretentious and pure rather than unsophisticated. He thought there was a kind of purity and sort of honesty and pragmatism to their taste that had to be sort of celebrated but also worked with. I love the chart on the right, which shows that if you were to launch a product in multiple colorways, hardly any of them would sell. In this particular chart, I think there's something like 22 different colors for the same product, and almost all of them, almost all of the sales, 69% of the sales come from the top 5 colors, and the rest kind of largely languish on the shelves. Hardly anybody buys them. He also found that the average consumer didn't really like buying a product that was in a color they couldn't quite name. If they thought there was something slightly off about the color, or they couldn't quite work out whether it was, blue or green or somewhere in between, that would be very off-putting. People liked sort of very pure, easily definable and recognizable colors. And this book came out during a surge of interest in pop psychology and psychoanalysis and so on, but also the ascendance of marketing and advertising. It was published just a year before Vance Packard's explosive book, The Hidden Persuaders, which presented advertising as a manipulative, malevolent force, making people buy things they didn't need and planting subliminal messages to control our spending patterns. Colourful packaging was one of the ways to do this. So Biren and Packard both recognized the growing power of advertisers, but also, I think, the complicity or projection on the part of members of the public who wanted to use colour as a form of self-expression, as a marker of aspiration and status. Again, this is all way ahead of its time, and it anticipates the popular science books of the last couple of decades on consumer behaviour, titles like Nudge and Predictably Irrational, that whole kind of nudge theory of economics. Biren was anticipating a great deal of that. And Biren's ideas percolated throughout industry, and they turned up in lots of places, from the academic to the populist. In the collection, we've got multiple copies of this lovely little booklet that was created by Biren. That was a quick guide to your personality type as defined by your favorite color. And it's often quite unflattering. So, I mean, my favorite color is yellow, and it says that anybody who likes yellow has a horribly high opinion of themselves. So I don't know quite what to make of that, but it's a little bit like a horoscope in that you can kind of read what you like into it, and you can even see that with the kind of sort of crystal ball type illustration on the front. But crucially, of course, this looks like a fun little booklet, but it's also an advert, and it's ultimately trying to sell people a range of paints. And it ends by the punchline is, no matter what color you like, we've got a paint to sell you. So. And Biren's work, his work in the 1950s anticipates one of the most popular works in the Colour Reference Library, which dates actually from the late 60s, early 70s. This is the Lucia colour test by the Swiss psychologist Max Lucia, who claimed to be able to divine people's personality types and neuroses based solely on their colour preferences. And each copy came with these 8 cards, and the reader was supposed to look at them without thinking about it, pair them off, sort of subconsciously pick their 2 favorite colors, then their second 2 favorite, then the third 2 favorite, down to their least 2 favorite. And then you turn the cards over, they're all numbered. You work through the kind of mathematical formulae in the book, and depending on the order in which you're adding them up and what they add up to, you get this incredibly acute kind of psychological profile. People laugh about it now. Lucia was quite defensive and said it's definitely not a parlor game, it's serious business. But it's interesting to me that all the colors seem sort of slightly off, and that there's kind of not an obvious kind of red. There's a very strange sort of yellow and so on. I think he must have put a lot of thought into making them deliberately those colors that you can't quite easily name, so that you're not just thinking, oh, I love red, so I'm going to go straight for red, because there isn't quite the sort of red you'd expect to see there. But this is as good a title as any, I think, to finish on, because all visitors, as mentioned, seem to love it. And it's one of those titles that really cuts across all the different types of people that I welcome to the Colour Reference Library, who all bring different expectations and understandings of colour. People can take the Lucia test seriously or not, but there's something quite impressive and profound, I think, about just the sort of primacy of staring at these colors and weighing up your feelings about them. That seems to really sort of appeal to everyone, whether they buy into the psychology or not. And like a lot of the titles in the Colour Reference Library, it's about the experience of color as much as the idea of it. So many of the books in the Colour Reference Library speak to that universality of color as something we all have a relationship with, and that always has the capacity to surprise and delight and maybe even subvert. And really, these are the qualities that we find across all the shelves, all the 2,000 books. They pull all the centuries and subjects together. They bind all the users and all of their questions. And they let our readers immerse themselves and find new ways of thinking about a subject as old as our existence and as wide as our lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Neil. That was great. Oh, we're seeing some applause reactions there all over the place. That's really great. So we haven't had any questions in the chat yet, but please, if anyone wants to ask a question, maybe just initially put it into the chat. I just had one question. Have you been active in digitizing any of the older volumes in your library, especially ones that might be unique to your library?
Yeah, that's a great question. The answer is yes. So we were lucky enough to get some funding back in 2018 to buy some pretty decent book scanners, and one that uses like 2 digital SLR cameras and so on. And I worked with a very good like project officer when we got that funding, who photographed quite a lot of color plates in the books, and that was the initial driver for that was to illustrate my own book, because we wanted to be able to license images that we'd taken to the publisher, and then also just to have them for anybody else who wanted to use them. So we've built up quite a sort of a digital library, not yet available to the public, though we're working on that. But we do have photos of a lot of the key color plates from a lot of the classic work. So a lot of the ones I mentioned, like Mary Gartside, Chabrol, and so on. Obviously, color management is a huge issue with trying to adequately capture hand-colored plates. So that's something we've had to be very mindful of, and that's posed certain challenges. The Mary Gartside is a good one. If you know that, it has all of these different coloured blots of kind of light and shade. And I know people who've been to see it in different libraries around the world because no two copies are alike because they're all kind of hand coloured and they're all kind of different manifestations. So, you know, we're really keen to share that sort of the images of the books that we have. We're not, you know, possessive about them, and we want to share those images. When I started writing my book, it was lockdown, so I couldn't actually get to my own library. I couldn't get to the color reference library to actually look at a lot of the books. So we ended up having to look at a lot of them on the Internet Archive's digitized versions that had come from, you know, a lot of libraries in the US and elsewhere. And that was so valuable to have that resource. But I was also aware that when I did get back in and looked at our original physical copies, something very different takes place when you're looking at kind of hand-colored works from the 18th and 19th centuries. So I'm aware that digitization can't completely replace that experience.
Sure, sure. Um, that would be the history of color, a universe of chromatic phenomena would be the book you're mentioning there, Neil.
That would be the one.
Yes. Excellent, excellent. I think that a few things have come in the chat. I don't know. Would you like me to read them, or would you like? There's one here. Uh, let's see. Can we check what books are in the library? Is the catalog
Yes, you
online?
can.
Hmm.
Yes, the catalogue is online. So if you go to library.rca.ac.uk, that is our kind of discovery platform, and it's quite difficult to narrow your search down to the color reference library. But the way to do it is
Uh-huh.
to do a blank search, just search for nothing, and you'll get something like 400,000 results. And what you then need to do is filter your results. So there's an option in the left-hand side of the screen called library location, and you go down to that bit and you tick the box that says color reference library, and suddenly your 400,000 titles will turn into something like 2,000 titles, and that will show
Oh,
you just what is in the color reference library. So
that's a great tip. Thank you. And there's a question here. Who is the library open to? Can we book in to use it?
yes, absolutely you can. There's only me and a part-time member of staff working on all the RCA's special collections. So we are quite busy, but we do warmly welcome external researchers. The best thing to do is to email special-collections at rca.ac.uk. And that will come to either me or my colleague Natasha, and one of us will get back to you. One of the things I say is you don't have to know exactly what you want to see before you come, because we do allow browsing on the shelves. You can make a selection and then we'll bring the books into the reading room. I tried to make it so that you don't just have to pick things from the library catalogue, because it has so many weird and wonderful things in it that
Mhm.
actually, you know, you don't know what you're going to find, and you might think you're interested in something and then you find something completely different on the shelves. That kind of serendipitous browsing is something we really want to support.
Fantastic. Great. There's a question just came in. Has there been any other theorist as influential on artists as Chevreul?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, there's certainly been a few like Ogden Rood, for instance.
Yes, yeah.
Um, I'm sure there's a few. Chevreul was an interesting one because of, well, I remember John Gage, the late great John Gage,
Mhm.
brilliant historian of colour and art, came to give a talk at the RCA years ago, soon after I started in conjunction with the colour group of Great Britain. And he said, oh, so many artists just are not interested in colour theory and historically just haven't embraced colour theory. And I find it a lot actually in working with artists in the colour reference library. Quite often the last thing they want to know is the science behind it, and they feel that that completely kind of neutralizes and kills off the creative process. So it's often quite difficult to tease out how much the kind of scientific writing of scholars explaining color theory and explaining perception and contrast and so on, how much that actually filters down. There are obvious people like Bridget Riley, let's say, who's completely embraced a lot of Chevreul's theories and really worked with it to get her optical illusions. Obviously, David Batchelor is incredibly steeped in color theory, but it's actually tracing a line between the original publication and the influence in art is quite challenging. But Chevreul's certainly up there as massively influential and still is.
Yep, yep, sure. There was a. Are you able to type anything into the chat there, Neil? There was a question.
Yes, yeah,
The
yeah.
web address again, please.
For the library catalogue.
For the it just says web address, but I think that's what they mean. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so that's the library catalogue, and then the email. I'll do
And the
the
RCA
email.
contact email. Yep, yep.
There we go.
Oh, there's a whole
Okay.
bunch of collections coming in. Of questions coming in now.
Yeah.
Can you give other examples of how artists use your collection for inspiration? Maybe you want to give one more, or
Um, I'm just trying to think whether I should name names.
yes, that's uh,
There's a very well-known, well, pretty well-known artist who works like overwhelmingly with color, who came to try to do essentially a new version of Dictionary of Color, and just to try to itemize every color ever, and to kind of make a book out of it, and found, as so many people did, that the scale of it defeated them. But they did have a lovely time looking at all of the samples. One of the books I put up was by Marion Duchars, who's a wonderful RCA alumna, and illustrator, and designed loads of book jackets and things, very well known here. And she did a wonderful book about color that I included a slide of. There are lots really, but it's actually, I tend not to keep tabs on them too much. I kind of deal with them when they come in, and then they go away, and I don't always get to see what
mm,
gets created as a result. One of the
right,
nice
yeah,
things about having our annual show, our degree show, when students kind of show off everything that they've done at their time at the RCA, is that I'll suddenly think, oh yes, I remember that person. They came to see me last October. And you can see how the books that they've absorbed, how it's kind of percolated into their work. And it's not just fine artists by any stretch. There's a lot of ceramicists who use the collection, for instance, and use
interesting.
that to inspire like three-dimensional color. Three-dimensional color is a question I get quite a lot, because a lot of the color theory that's in the books is very much kind of flat and static and side
Yeah,
by side on the page.
yeah.
But we have a lot of people working in 3 dimensions, of course.
Oh, great. They're coming in, but I think we might have to wrap it up soon. There's one I missed a little bit earlier on from Ruth that looks interesting. Has neuroscience opened up new ideas about the experience of color? And does the library have any books on this?
That is a good question. And I would say that's possibly one of the shortcomings of the color reference library, that it is still, even though we buy new books about color, it is still quite historical, and it's quite slow moving, in that we don't have very much about cutting edge technology and cutting edge findings. They take quite a while to percolate down into books. So when people ask me questions like that, I will often sort of refer them to the online journals and things that the college subscribes to, or they might just have to wait, or they might have to, write the research themselves, because we don't have everything. But yeah, in terms of sort of color perception, there's certainly quite a lot about it in the color reference library, but it tends to be probably among the least popular titles, again, because people want that kind of experiential relationship with colour, the sort of users we attract anyway. If we were at Imperial College, there's the like science and technology university down the road from us, I think we'd have a very different user base. But we have a user base that wants kind of emotional relationship with colour, practical, immersive, experiential, that sort of thing, rather than the neuroscience side of things.
Thank you. Great. All right then. Well, I think I'd just like to thank you again, Neil. That was everything we'd hoped for and more, I think, and it was really wonderful to see your interesting your tastes and the books that sort of stand out to you as being of interest. So thanks very much.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
All right then.
Tremendous, very, very informative. Thank you.
Good. All right then.
Cheers, David.
Bye.
See you soon.
See you
Bye.
everyone. Bye bye. Thank you.